At the height of its glory, Rome stood as an empire without end. Its armies moved like thunder across continents, swallowing kingdoms whole, bending nations until their spines snapped, and leaving behind a trail of roads, walls, and ruins that still scar the earth today. To face Rome was to face inevitability itself, the crushing weight of history, the certainty that resistance would end in fire, chains, and blood. And yet, there was one land where all that power broke. One place where Rome's perfect machine faltered. A land where the empire's reach, seemingly infinite, was forced to stop. It was not Persia, with its legendary wealth. Not Carthage, with its fierce warlords. Not Egypt, the jewel of the Nile. No. It was a land of mist and mountains. A land of bogs, forests, and shadows. A land whose warriors fought not for empire, nor for gold, but for the right to remain untamed. That land was Caledonia, the place we now call Scotland. Rome had already taken Gaul. Hispania had been absorbed. Egypt became its province, feeding the empire with endless grain. Judea had been broken, chained, and taxed into submission. Even the Parthians, Rome's fiercest rivals in the east, had been checked within borders that Rome defined. Britain, too, had fallen, its tribes crushed beneath the weight of Roman forts, roads, and amphitheaters. To Rome, Caledonia was supposed to be just another step. Another name carved onto the map. Another inevitable conquest. But here, something happened that Rome had never experienced before. Why did the legions falter in the highlands of the north? Why did disciplined soldiers, forged in deserts, mountains, and battlefields across the known world, crumble in a land of mist and stone? Why did emperors pour men, treasure, and decades of effort into a territory they could never tame? The answer lies not only in battles, but in the land itself. In endless rains that turned roads into rivers. In forests so dense they swallowed whole armies. In mountains that rose like fortresses carved by the gods themselves. And in the people who called this land home, warriors painted in blue, tribes without kings or cities, bound not by empire, but by the unbreakable knowledge that no foreigner would ever own their soil. This is not merely the story of a failed conquest. It is the story of a clash of worlds. The pride of an empire that believed itself eternal, and the defiance of a people who refused to be erased. Rome's reach was vast, its power engineered through centuries of blood and discipline. But in the mists of Scotland, Rome met its limit. And that limit would scar its legacy forever. Before we dive deeper into this story, ask yourself this: if even Rome, the greatest empire of the ancient world, could not conquer Scotland, how much more impossible is it for you to resist pressing subscribe to Disturbing Tale? And if you dare to resist, at least tell us why in the comments, and let history judge your reason. Rome was not born invincible. Its supremacy was not a gift of the gods, but a system engineered, refined, and perfected through centuries of blood and calculation. By the time its legions looked north toward Caledonia, the empire had turned conquest into a science. Roads were its arteries, straight lines carved across deserts, mountains, and forests, binding provinces together, ensuring that soldiers could march faster than rebellion could rise. Forts and watchtowers stood like the teeth of some vast predator, biting into every frontier. They weren't just military outposts, they were statements of permanence, marks of a power that turned landscapes into machines of war. When Rome laid siege to a city, terror itself marched with them. Stone walls that had stood for centuries fell to Roman discipline. Engineers assembled rams, towers, and catapults with precision so cold it seemed mechanical. And while the legions advanced like a single organism, shield, spear, and discipline united, resistance cracked. No city was safe. No fortress could hold. But Rome's conquest wasn't built on violence alone. It conquered with persuasion just as much as with iron. A defeated leader might awake to find himself wearing a Roman toga instead of chains. His children would be enrolled in Roman schools, learning Latin and rhetoric. His name might even be etched into the records of the Senate. To resist Rome was to risk obliteration. To submit was to be absorbed, reborn as part of something greater. Gaul offers the clearest example. For generations, its tribes resisted, clashing with Rome in bloody uprisings. But in the end, Julius Caesar shattered their unity at Alesia. Vercingetorix, the chieftain who dared to bind Gaul together, was dragged in chains through the streets of Rome before being strangled in a dungeon. Gaul did not vanish. Instead, it was reborn. Roman roads, Roman temples, Roman laws, and Roman markets spread like veins across the land. What was once foreign became Roman. Judea, too, felt the weight of the legions. When revolt burned in the hills, Rome answered with fire and stone. The temple itself, the heart of a people, was torn down, its treasures paraded in triumph through the imperial capital. Resistance was not negotiated. It was obliterated. And even then, Rome planted its taxes, its laws, its garrisons, ensuring that what was broken remained under its shadow. Even Germania, wild, dangerous Germania, eventually bent. At Teutoburg Forest, 3 entire legions had been wiped out, their eagles lost, their soldiers butchered. Rome had been humiliated. But the empire did not abandon the fight. For decades, campaigns raged, clawing back land, planting fortified lines, and absorbing tribes into Rome's machine. In the long run, Germania became less a wilderness and more a frontier Rome could manage. This was the empire's rhythm. Crush resistance, absorb the survivors, reshape the land and its people until nothing remained of what had been. For Rome, conquest was never just about victory in battle. It was about transformation, erasing the old and replacing it with Roman order. So when generals turned their eyes toward Caledonia, they saw no exception. To them, it was just another wild province waiting to be carved into the empire's body. Another land to tame with roads and walls. Another people to pacify with citizenship and coin. They believed their formula would not fail. Because it never had. But what they did not understand was that Caledonia was not like Gaul, or Judea, or Germania. Those lands could be broken because their people had cities, kings, temples, centers of power that could be destroyed or co-opted. Caledonia had none of that. No cities to burn. No kings to bribe. No throne to seize. Instead, Rome found only forests, mountains, and tribes that melted into the mist like ghosts. And ghosts cannot be conquered by discipline or by iron. And if you're still watching this tale unfold without subscribing to Disturbing Tale, perhaps you too are like those Caledonian ghosts, vanishing into the mist. But unlike Rome, we can still find you in the comments, so explain your resistance there. When the legions marched northward into Caledonia, they expected warriors. What they found was something far worse. The land itself rose against them. At first glance, it seemed ordinary, rolling hills, stretches of green, valleys cloaked in mist. But beneath that beauty lurked treachery. What looked like solid ground could suddenly vanish beneath their feet, sucking carts, horses, even soldiers into bogs that swallowed them whole. It was as though the very soil demanded blood, dragging Rome's finest down into the dark earth. Forests thicker than anything the empire had seen in Germania stretched endlessly, so dense that sunlight rarely reached the ground. Within those shadows, silence reigned, broken only by the groaning wind that made the trees themselves seem like hostile spirits. These were not the cultivated landscapes Rome was used to reshaping into farms and cities. They were wild fortresses, with walls of roots and thickets stronger than stone. And then came the weather. Modern archaeological studies reveal what ancient soldiers already knew: the climate in northern Britain during Rome's campaigns was harsher than it is today. Colder. Wetter. More merciless. Rain fell in endless sheets, drenching soldiers, rotting supplies, and corroding weapons before battle even began. Tents collapsed under the weight of water. Fog rolled across valleys without warning, erasing roads, dissolving formations, and swallowing entire columns in blinding silence. The winters were long and brutal, freezing rivers, stiffening limbs, and killing soldiers in their camps before they ever faced an enemy. Summers brought no relief, only damp, feverish heat that spread sickness like wildfire. Rome's legions had been forged to fight men. In Caledonia, they were forced to fight the land itself. Dysentery tore through camps where the ground never dried. Leather straps snapped, shields warped, sandals tore against moss-slick stone. Armor rusted before it could ever meet an enemy blade. Legionaries who had marched across deserts and over mountains now found themselves broken by the simple act of standing guard in Scotland's endless rain. Rome's strength had always been order, discipline, control. But here, order dissolved into mud and mist. Hadrian's engineers had once prided themselves on bending nature into submission, aqueducts that carried rivers across valleys, roads that stretched straight as arrows across mountains, walls that cut through wilderness like scars of stone. But in Scotland, nature fought back. Rivers overflowed, washing away roads before they could be finished. Hillsides collapsed under the pounding rain, burying forts before they were complete. Forests closed in behind every cleared path, as though the land itself was erasing Rome's presence day by day. The legions brought iron, fire, and discipline, but none of it could clear a bog or burn away fog. Caledonia was not simply resisting with warriors. It resisted with its very essence, as though the earth itself had sworn never to kneel. And if Scotland's storms could break the iron discipline of Rome, imagine what your single click on subscribe could do for disturbing tale. But if you won't, at least storm the comments, and tell us why. Because the land was only half the story. The other half was far more terrifying. For beyond the forests, hidden in the mist, Rome's soldiers soon discovered a people who refused to fight by Rome's rules. A people who were everywhere, and nowhere. A people who turned shadows into weapons. If the land itself had become Rome's first enemy, the people of Caledonia became the second, and together, they formed a force that the empire could never subdue. The Romans called them the Picti, the painted ones. Their bodies were marked with spirals, jagged symbols, and streaks of blue made from woad dye so permanent it seemed carved into their very flesh. To Roman eyes, they looked less like men and more like spirits torn from the mist, half human, half apparition. Creatures not just of the land, but of its rage. And yet what truly terrified the legions was not their appearance. It was how they lived, and how they fought. Unlike the Gauls, the Picts had no great chieftains that Rome could bribe, assassinate, or parade in chains. Unlike the Judeans, they had no central temple to burn, no sacred heart that could be torn from them. Unlike the Germans, they had no single king whose defeat could mean the submission of his people. The Picts were not bound by crowns or cities. They existed as scattered tribes, tied together only by kinship and land. To Rome, this seemed like weakness. No government. No cities worth capturing. No central authority to cut down. But it was their greatest strength. There was nothing Rome could seize. No throne to steal. No capital to occupy. No symbol of unity to destroy. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing of his father-in-law Agricola's campaign, described the Caledonians as fierce, restless, and quick to vanish. They never gave Rome what it wanted, a battlefield where legions could clash in open formation, where Roman discipline could break disorganized tribes. Instead, the Picts fought like smoke. Scouts melted into fog unseen. Warriors descended on patrols in the dead of night, slashing throats, stealing supplies, and vanishing before alarms could be raised. When Rome retaliated, they found only empty hills and footprints lost in the mud. This was not war as the empire understood it. It was not the clash of formations, the organized destruction of fortresses, the conquest of cities. It was silence, followed by chaos. Ambushes in narrow glens. Arrows loosed from unseen ridges. stones crashing down onto marching columns. The enemy was everywhere, and nowhere. Rome's greatest strength, organization, became its weakness. Heavy armor slowed soldiers in bogs. Tight formations splintered in forests. Long supply lines stretched across hostile ground were easy prey for raiders. Rome wanted a war of order. The Picts gave them a war of shadows. And in those shadows, Rome's invincibility cracked. No victory was permanent. No fort was safe. Even when the legions built strongholds deep in Caledonia, the Picts circled them like wolves. They cut off supplies, struck at stragglers, and vanished before a counterattack could form. Rome had fought kings, armies, and nations. But it had never fought a people who refused even the dignity of defeat. Rome wanted submission. The Picts gave them silence. And if you're silent right now instead of subscribing to Disturbing Tale, you're siding with Rome, beaten and humiliated in the Scottish mist. Don't betray history like that. Because the empire had always advanced with certainty. Every frontier had been another step forward, another scar carved into the earth. But here, in the shadowed glens of Caledonia, that rhythm faltered. And what followed was something Rome had never dared before, an admission of limits. By the year 122, Rome had been fighting in Caledonia long enough to know a terrible truth: conquest was not guaranteed. And for the first time in its long history, the empire made a choice it had never dared before. It stopped. The man who made that choice was Emperor Hadrian, known for his discipline and pragmatism. He ordered a wall to be built, not to expand Rome's reach, but to limit it. Stretching over 100 kilometers from sea to sea, Hadrian's wall was more than stone. It was a scar carved across the landscape, declaring, "This far, and no further." Watchtowers and forts studded its length. Soldiers patrolled its heights. But its very existence admitted something Rome almost never confessed: there were lands beyond its grasp. The empire had built roads to conquer, aqueducts to endure, and walls to defend victories. But this wall was different. It was not a triumph, it was a confession. Yet Rome's pride refused to die so easily. A generation later, another emperor sought to erase Hadrian's admission of failure. Antoninus Pius ordered a new frontier, pushing north into Caledonian ground. His wall, built of turf and timber rather than stone, stretched further into the mist. It was meant to project strength, to show that Rome's advance had not truly stopped. But the Picts harried its garrisons, cut its supplies, and wore down the men stationed in its lonely outposts. Within just 2 decades, the Antonine Wall was abandoned. Turf crumbled back into earth. Wood rotted. And Rome's soldiers retreated once again behind Hadrian's stone. The Antonine Wall became nothing more than a ghost, reclaimed by rain, bog, and forest until only traces remained. Even Rome's most ambitious forts could not anchor themselves here. At Inchtuthil, a massive fortress was begun, designed to hold thousands of soldiers and secure the north. It was a marvel of engineering, supplied with iron, stone, and discipline. And yet before it was ever completed, it too was abandoned. Archaeologists would one day uncover caches of iron buried in haste, hidden so the Picts would never seize them. The fort stood not as a monument of strength, but as a silent witness to failure. But Rome was not finished. The most desperate act came in the reign of Septimius Severus. In the year 208, the emperor himself, old, ill, but unyielding, marched north at the head of one of the largest armies ever assembled in Britain. His purpose was not negotiation, nor assimilation. It was annihilation. Villages were burned. Crops destroyed. Forests cut down. Rivers forced aside to open paths for the advance. The legions marched with fire and steel, determined to starve the Picts into submission. But the land did not yield. Rain turned roads into rivers of mud. Disease spread faster than fire. Soldiers collapsed with fever, their wounds rotting before they could heal. Supplies vanished into bogs, swallowed by ambush and storm. The legions pressed forward only to find emptiness. The Picts would not stand in open battle. They vanished into the highlands, returning only to strike from the mist at exhausted soldiers. Rome's army was not destroyed in glorious combat. It was devoured, by exhaustion, despair, and the endless cruelty of the land. Severus himself grew weaker as the campaign dragged on. In the city of Eboracum, modern York, he succumbed to illness before any victory could be claimed. The emperor who had promised to break Caledonia died with nothing to show but wasted legions and abandoned forts. His death marked not only the end of his campaign, but the end of Rome's dream of conquering the north. Rome built walls to mask its failure. But those walls still whisper what the empire would not say. Here, in the mists of Scotland, Rome was broken. And if you build your own wall now against subscribing to Disturbing Tale, then history will remember you just as it remembers Hadrian, as the one who gave up. For Rome, conquest was never only about glory. Every province had to justify its existence. Roads, garrisons, walls, and endless campaigns consumed fortunes, and those fortunes demanded repayment. Victory was an investment. And in every corner of its empire, Rome demanded returns. In Gaul, the empire found fertile fields, timber, and vast numbers of slaves. In Hispania, silver mines filled Rome's coffers. Egypt became its granary, its Nile feeding not just its own people but Rome itself. Even Germania, though wild and troublesome, provided timber, iron, and men for the legions. Every conquest, however bloody, yielded profit. But Caledonia gave nothing in return. There were no great cities to tax. No kings to extort tribute from. No markets to seize. No wealth to funnel southward. The land was fractured, the people scattered, and the economy invisible to Roman eyes. Archaeology shows small pockets of iron, lead, and even gold in southern Scotland, but they were out of reach. Mines required stability, supply lines, and infrastructure. None of those could survive in a land where roads collapsed under rain and where every worker lived in constant fear of ambush. Even agriculture, the backbone of every Roman province, failed the empire here. Fields were patchy, soil thin, climate unforgiving. They could not feed legions stretched hundreds of miles from the heart of Rome. The cost of holding the frontier mounted relentlessly. Supplies had to be dragged from the south across hostile terrain, guarded every step of the way. Convoys became targets, shredded by warriors who knew every trail and bog. Every ambush meant not only dead soldiers but lost provisions, and with them, more replacements drained from the empire's thinning manpower. Roman roads, once symbols of permanence and order, turned into traps in Caledonia, washed out by floods, swallowed by moss and mud, or abandoned to silence. The further north Rome pushed, the less secure its hold became. Until the empire itself began to ask the question no general wanted to hear, was it worth it? Treasury records from later centuries echo the strain. Campaign after campaign drained coin, soldiers, and patience into a land that gave back nothing but death. Provinces that once enriched Rome now strained to cover its losses. War was supposed to feed empire. But Caledonia only consumed it. And so Rome withdrew. Not because it was merciful. Not because it was wise. But because the cost of staying outweighed the glory of conquest. The empire's greatest weapon, its ability to turn victory into profit, had no effect here. The north swallowed coin, swallowed soldiers, swallowed decades. And it gave Rome nothing in return. And if you think that sounds familiar, perhaps it should. Because right now, your silence is costing this channel. The investment is made, the story is here. All it needs is your return. Subscribe to Disturbing Tale, or explain in the comments why you resist, like Caledonia itself resisted Rome. Caledonia was more than just a stubborn frontier. It became a scar carved into the flesh of empire, a reminder that even Rome's might had limits. Everywhere else, Rome had expanded with certainty. Gaul wore Roman togas. Egypt paid Roman taxes. Hispania built Roman theaters. Judea, though scarred, lived under Roman law. Conquest meant transformation. But Caledonia remained untamed. The hills and forests of Scotland became a symbol not of what Rome gained, but of what it could never claim. And this failure changed everything. For centuries, Rome had grown by swallowing new lands, each conquest feeding the next. But after Caledonia, the advance slowed, and then stopped. Instead of pouring resources into new provinces, emperors poured them into walls, garrisons, and watchtowers. Hadrian's wall was not just stone, it was an admission. A declaration that Rome had met its edge. Beyond it lay not just the painted tribes, but the boundary of Roman destiny. The empire shifted from expansion to containment. From dreams of endless growth to the grim reality of defending what it already possessed. And in that shift, Rome's identity began to change. No longer the predator that devoured kingdoms, Rome became a walled giant, guarding its own fading strength. Its greatest victories lay in the past. Its future was no longer conquest, but survival. Yet the defiance of the Picts lived on as legend. Here was a people without kings, without cities, without written records, and still, they humiliated the most powerful empire the world had ever known. Not through great battles or monumental victories, but simply by refusing to yield. They proved that an empire could burn villages, but not spirit. That legions could slaughter thousands, but could not kill defiance. Their silence became louder than Rome's legions. Their refusal became immortal. And the lesson was darker still. Rome believed it was eternal. But Caledonia whispered otherwise. No empire, no matter how vast, no conqueror, no matter how disciplined, lasts forever. Every power meets its boundary. Every ruler meets the frontier he cannot cross. In the silence of Scotland's mists, Rome faced its own mortality. And the echo of that defeat lingers still, in the ruins of abandoned forts, in the crumbled lines of walls built to contain shadows, in the nameless stones that whisper of Rome's shame. The empire that had devoured nations discovered its own limit in the bogs and mountains of the north. Scotland was not simply unconquered. It was unconquerable. And if you've made it this far without clicking subscribe to Disturbing Tale, then you too have proven unconquerable. But unlike Rome, we will not retreat. We'll meet you in the comments, and ask you, was this defeat inevitable, or could Rome have broken Scotland if it had fought differently? Because that question, like the echo of Rome's failure, has lingered for centuries. The shadow of Rome stretched across continents. Its road stitched nations together. Its laws reshaped the lives of millions. Its armies crushed kings, burned cities, and devoured worlds. But in the mists of Scotland, Rome broke. The land itself rose against the empire, with bogs that swallowed carts, forests that smothered armies, and storms that corroded weapons before they ever touched an enemy. The people, painted in blue, bound not by kings or cities but by defiance, struck from the shadows and vanished before Rome's formations could turn. And when brute force failed, when emperors raised walls and armies swelled to tens of thousands, Caledonia still refused to yield. Here, Rome discovered that its frontier was not only physical but human. That even the greatest empire the world had ever known could be undone by a land that gave nothing and a people who would not kneel. Scotland was not simply unconquered. It was unconquerable. The lesson it left behind echoes across centuries, that no empire, no matter how vast, no power, no matter how disciplined, lasts forever. Every ruler meets his limit. Every conquest meets its wall. In the silence of Scotland's mists, Rome heard the whisper of its own mortality. And that whisper has never faded. Even today, the ruins remain. The stones of Hadrian's wall. The ghosts of abandoned forts. The standing circles of ancient tribes, defiant against time. They remind us that resistance, however fragile, however scattered, can outlast empires. Rome could not erase the spirit of Caledonia. And in failing to do so, Rome revealed its own humanity, vulnerable, finite, and destined, like all powers, to fall. So now, I leave you with a question. Do you believe Rome could ever have conquered Scotland if it had fought differently? Or was defeat inevitable from the very first step into the mist? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice now joins a debate that has echoed for nearly 2,000 years. And remember, this has been Disturbing Tale, where history doesn't just live, it fights back. Subscribe now, or be remembered, like Rome in Scotland, as the one who stood at the edge of history, and failed to take the next step.